At Odds and Ends by Corndog_Patrol and For the Wolfie on AO3. Chapter 11 Hot Chocolate. Shota's instincts were blaring. At first, he thought it was from the storm outside, which had been the original reason he couldn't sleep. But now he felt as if he was being watched. Shouta rolled over, but continued to fret sleep, while his ears searched for any nearby noise. The storm rumbled outside, however, making any other sound undetectable. And then he saw it. A small line of light. Someone was peering in through the door of his room. He restrained his heart so it continued to beat slowly, to not give away that he was on edge. The crack of light grew larger and larger, and a silhouette stood amongst the glow. For a moment, the light reminded him of flames. Amongst the fire stood a shadowy figure. "You awake?" asked a soft voice, and his senses immediately eased, although he wished that hadn't been their first reaction. The door opened, however. Hizashi didn't step inside without an answer. Shouta exhaled and sat up. Sweat ran down his forehead, but he quickly wiped it away before he noticed how panicked he was. "Now I am," he grumbled. "What's wrong?" "I couldn't sleep." Hizashi stepped into his room and set the candle on the bedside table. His fancy clothes had been replaced with an oversized shirt, and Shouta refused to consider how handsome he looked, even in the slip of things. "I could never sleep during a storm." "How'd you know?" Hizashi tilted his head, confused by the question, until Shouta explained. "How'd you know I hate storms?" Hizashi shrugged. "You kept staring out the window during dinner, and your expression was concerned. Bad memories?" "Bad memories." Shouta closed his eyes, and an image of falling ceiling beams wrapped around a small body came to mind. He still remembered how the rain had felt as it seeped through the cracks above to run over his face, but his arms had been pinned, so he had no way of wiping them wet. "You have a lot of scars," Hizashi pointed out. "Sorry, but they're hard not to notice." "It's fine," he said softly. There was an awkward silence, as if the blonde expected him to expand on the comment, but he didn't. Hizashi sighed. "I just thought maybe you'd like some company on a dark, stormy night. I know I would. Do you like hot chocolate?" Shouta went to say no, but his voice abandoned him at the mention of the final word, chocolate. He found his voice again, and tentatively asked, "You have chocolate?" "A powder form," Hizashi confirmed with a smile. "Can I tempt you?" Shouta nodded and pulled himself from bed, but Hizashi glanced down and turned red. He looked away, quickly, and fidgeted. First, you might want to put on some clothes." He hadn't had any clothes informal enough for pajamas, so he decided to sleep naked instead. Maybe that hadn't been the best idea. "You're not straight," Shouta said as he grabbed some clothes from his wardrobe. Hizashi continued to fidget. "I am." "It's fine," Shouta said, more softly. "I don't know what came over me the other day. You're not my type, so you don't need to be worried." Hizashi stopped fidgeting. "Okay, I'm not. I just know you don't like vampires, and I hate the thought of you pressuring yourself. You don't owe me anything, just so you know. You don't owe me your body or your blood." So that's why Hizashi had rejected him. Shouta snorted. "You must hate it. You got a donor, but you can't even drink from them." "I don't hate it," Hizashi said immediately as he turned around. Thankfully, Shouta had just finished dressing. "I like having you around, I won't lie. I was looking forward to having a donor to drink from, but that wasn't the reason I got a donor. I wanted to save someone from the streets, and it's well known that donors are usually the most desperate, especially if they come from a good bloodline." "I heard Hakamada talking to Tensei once. He mentioned something about a number. Hisashi flinched and picked up the candle. I'll tell you, but I'd rather we have the conversation over some hot chocolate. Shouta agreed, and they left the room. As they passed the stairway up, Hisashi glanced at it. You went up there? It was tempting to say no, but Tensei had probably told Hisashi the truth. So, Shouta said, Yes. I didn't get into the locked rooms, though. Hisashi nodded, but said nothing more on the matter as they reached the staircase down. Soon enough, they were in the kitchen. Although it was an internal room without windows, the storm could still be heard in the background, echoing like the halls of ghosts. Shouta leaned against the bench while Hisashi set to work on making them each a hot chocolate, starting by putting a kettle of water on the stove. So, any reason you don't like storms? Hisashi asked, as he busied himself with mugs and an old weathered tin that smelled very sweet. As Shouta watched, the vampire placed several heaped spoonfuls in both cups. My house collapsed when I was just a boy, Shouta admitted, although he was still debating how much he wanted to tell Hisashi. I was trapped under the rubble for 2 days before I was rescued. I couldn't move my arms, and the water leaked in. I nearly died of hypothermia. Was it the storm? Did the storm knock down your home? Hisashi clarified. For a moment, Shouta heard screaming in the distance, but he knew it was only a memory. The screams were from his family as they'd been slaughtered, one by one, while Shouta had been hidden and helpless beneath the debris. Yes, he lied. I'm so sorry to hear that, Hisashi repeated, and, to his credit, his voice was genuine. No wonder you hate storms. And you? Shouta asked, taking the pressure off him. What makes a scary vampire afraid of a bit of water? Hisashi looked grim. He turned and leaned against the side of the table while he unbuttoned the front of his shirt. Shouta was confused until the blonde parted enough to reveal his chest. On the right-hand side, the skin was cruelly marked by an angry scar. It had a singular pinpoint to it, and Shouta instantly recognized it for what it was, a bullet wound. The skin was taut around it, signaling its age. It was storming when I almost died, Hisashi said quietly. I thought the rain would be the last thing I'd ever hear. There was a scream. Shouta thought it was his memory again, but then he noticed the steaming spewing from the boiled kettle. Hisashi hastily buttoned his shirt, but Shouta stepped forward. I'll pour, he said, and grabbed the kettle. Hisashi relaxed a little and took more time buttoning his shirt while Shouta poured boiling water into both mugs. If there was a scar left behind, it must have been the result of a silver bullet. Surviving such a wound would have been a miracle in itself, since even the silver residue would have stopped the wound from healing for a while. Was it a vampire slayer? Shouta asked, not looking at Hisashi. My father. Shouta slipped, the hot water missing the mug and spilled onto the bench. He cursed and put the kettle to its side so he could clean it up, but Hisashi stopped him. It's okay, I'll clean it. He picked up a mug of hot chocolate and offered it to him. Shouta took it, and Hisashi found a cloth to clean up the spilled water. I'm sorry to hear that, said the human. It's an old wound, by the looks of it. It healed well for silver. I was 10, Hisashi said softly, distantly, and picked up his own mug. It had a lot of time to heal. What had the vampire done to deserve a silver bullet to the chest? No, even a slayer couldn't imagine a 10-year-old doing anything deserving of that, whether they were human or a vampire. You're lucky to survive a wound like that, Shouta added, unsure of what else he could say. Hisashi nodded and sipped the drink, but then scrunched his nose in disgust. Sorry, I don't think I made it right. Shouta sipped at his last. It was somehow both bitter and plain, but there was still a trace of chocolate to it. I think you're supposed to add milk and sugar. Hisashi pursed his lips and grabbed a jar of sugar so he could sprinkle some in. Sorry, I'm kinda useless at this sort of stuff. Shouta shook his head. It's fine. The blonde shot him a smirk at his repeated catchphrase, and he felt his cheeks warm a little. I mean, it's sweet. If you think it's sweet, you have crazy taste buds. Shouta snorted. The gesture, not the drink. He shrugged. I should thank you for being awake to join me. Shouta sipped more of his hot chocolate. Even though the storm continued outside, he felt calmer, although the thought of what Hisashi had told him about his father made his mind buzz. It explained why the main bedroom on the top floor was disused. Perhaps the upstairs study had belonged to his father too, along with the mysterious locked room. You lost your parents when your house collapsed, didn't you? Hisashi's voice was so quiet, but the roar that rushed through Shota's ears was deafening. He stared at the blonde, his mouth suddenly bitter than the chocolate. Sorry, you once mentioned you've been in an orphanage. Shota swallowed and looked away. Don't want to talk about it. Sorry, Hisashi quickly said. I didn't mean to pry. Shota scratched the back of his neck and sipped his drink. He felt a tad guilty for being so dismissive with talking about his own pain after Hisashi had mentioned being shot by his own father. However, Shota didn't trust himself to talk about it without accidentally revealing the truth. The last thing Hisashi needed to learn was that a crazed vampire had killed Shota's family. Hisashi downed the rest of his drink, despite how hot it was, and grinned sheepishly at him. Well, I think I should be able to sleep now. Sorry for unloading all this stuff on you. Shota shook his head and finished his drink too, burning his tongue in the process. It's fine, I hope your father didn't go unpunished. Hisashi nodded. A vampire slayer rescued me. He reached into a pocket on the front of his nightshirt and pulled out a round watch. It was shiny with care, but permanently tarnished from age, and on the outside read the words, For you. However, he didn't check the time. Shota nodded back. His eyes caught on the pocket watch, while his mind was still in the conversation. A slayer hadn't rescued him from the collapsing rubble, but one had given him his vengeance. It was the only reason why Shota was one nowadays. You're not scared of slayers? Hisashi snorted like it was a joke, but didn't answer the question. You're safe here, Shota, I promise you. The blonde smiled at him, and even though he couldn't completely hide his fangs, the human found it endearing. For a moment, Shota genuinely wished he was the person Hisashi thought he was. Shota had never expected to meet a vampire like the blonde in his life, but he was kind and considerate and warm. Hisashi's smell fell, and he quickly looked away, as if he heard Shota's thoughts. I don't think I ever apologized. He murmured, cryptically. Shota tilted his head. For what? Giving you that bite mark, when we first met. Hisashi looked ashamed. I was weak. Would you have returned me if I'd said no? Hisashi looked surprised at that. Of course not. There was a pause, and his face flushed. In the waiting room, I was joking when I said I wouldn't take you in. I just wanted to act cool, since you seemed so cool and... His face turned redder, and he scratched the back of his head. And handsome. You're very convincing, Shota mumbled, remembering the pain of his nails and his wrists when he forced himself to bleed. Hisashi looked sheepish. Like I already said, you're safe here. I don't want to hurt you. That's not what I wanted to do when I bit you earlier, and I'm sorry I did. You got a new place here, and a storm isn't strong enough to destroy what we've built. Hisashi smiled at him, and there was something about it that felt shy and innocent. You can be content. The idea of being content was dangerous for the Slayer. Considering everything, it felt wrong to be at peace. Maybe, Hisashi continued, you won't hate vampires anymore. A burst of anger flared in his chest, sudden desire to inform him that he didn't have to like leeches. But the feeling was quenched by something cool. He remembered a woman with long, black hair and a delightful smile, and although he didn't want to reveal anything to Sashi, his mouth hadn't heard the memo. My mother was. He managed to cut himself off in time. Hisashi looked at him, confused, but Shouta shook his head. Forget it. He scratched his neck as guilt returned. Thank you for letting me stay. I will try to remain a pleasant house guest. I look forward to teaching you the cello, Hisashi said with a wink. He went to move away from the bench, but then went tumbling. Shouta didn't hesitate to reach forward and grab him, instinctively holding him close to steady his legs. Their faces were close together, to the point where Shouta could feel heat radiating off his skin, and Hisashi's face turned bright red. His heart was thundering so loudly that Shouta heard it. Sorry, Hisashi said quickly, voice higher than usual. Some water must have gotten on the floor. Thanks for catching me. An epiphany struck. Shouta immediately let go of the vampire and stepped back. Hisashi righted himself, his face still scarlet. Shouta wasn't exactly a social butterfly, but you didn't survive a vampire slayer without having some ability to read others. And right now, Hizashi Yamada was blatantly, yet unknowingly, obvious. The leech had a crush on the slayer. Shouta was dead silent, unaware of what to exactly do with that information. Hisashi murmured, fidgeting with his fingers like a schoolgirl. I guess I'll head to bed. Don't want to be too sleepy for tomorrow. Do you know the way back to your room from here? Shouta shrugged, nodding. His voice continued to fail him. Hisashi waited, awkwardly, but once he realized the slayer had nothing to say, he left. Shouta grabbed the bench for support, and panic set in. The vampire had a crush on him. He didn't know how that was possible, considering what a terrible impression he tended to leave on people. His feet carried him from the kitchen, automatically carrying him back towards his bedroom. Even while his mind raced, however, his thoughts paused at the sight of a vase full of sweet, white flowers. They were wilting, and he imagined Murray would replace them in the morning, but he couldn't stop himself from pulling one from it. He cradled the flower tenderly in his hand. Right now, his mission was top priority. Shota's own farewell was secondary, and so were the strange feelings of a certain blonde vampire. It only left one question. Would Hisashi's crush make Shota's quest more or less difficult? 10 days remaining. Hisashi could barely focus on his paperwork. Every time he tried to read the words, his mind would drift to thoughts of Shouta. Despite this, the blonde refused to believe he had a crush on the human. After all, Shouta hated vampires. Hisashi wasn't an exception to that. Hisashi tried to fathom a reason for this change within him. How come 100 suitors who'd arrived at his door, the ones who were winning his heart, was the brash, vampire-hating human? As handsome as Shouta was, Hisashi wasn't that shallow. He'd had handsomer suitors he had turned away, and ones that were far more charming. There was something sad in Shota's eyes, and it spoke to Hisashi in a way that required no words. They were somehow alike, and Hisashi was drawn to him like a moth to flame. He couldn't even begin to explain it. Shouta had a good heart beneath his brash exterior. Still, he doubted Shouta would have been keen to keep a relationship with him, and the gossiping around in Hisashi would only grow worse. For a human and a vampire to be accepted by society, they would both have to be from powerful bloodlines. Although Shouta was certainly from old blood, his family name hadn't been on any of the approving documents, which usually meant it was insignificant. He sighed and leaned back in his chair. There was no way his paperwork was getting finished today. His eyes turned to the window. Clouds were gathering on the horizon, and although it had yet to begin, he knew another storm was approaching. Perhaps they had another night of sipping nicer hot chocolate in the kitchen. Hizashi smiled goofily at the thought. How'd you sleep? The bun practically jumped out of his skin in surprise when Tensei wheeled in. Fine, Hizashi said quickly, doing his best to hide his grin. Tensei placed a bowl of sliced fruit on his desk, but looked at him apprehensively. You slept? Fine. It was storming. Right. Tensei knew all about his issue with storms. I had a drink with Shouta. Hot chocolate, not blood. He sheepishly scratched the back of his neck, and then brightened. You should teach me how to make good hot chocolate. My version tastes terrible. Rather than looking pleased about Hizashi bonding with Shouta, Tensei's expression grew concerned. Hizashi, I think you should be careful around him. His voice was lower than usual, and each word was said with emphasis. Hizashi stared at him, confused. Didn't Tensei approve of Shouta? They were distracted by the sound of rain against the window, but it only drew them away momentarily. Hizashi scratched the side of his face. I know he doesn't really like vampires, but neither did Namuri when she first came here. I'm not going to rush into anything or force him to like me or anything. You know me. Tensei shook his head. It's not your actions I'm concerned about. You're concerned about Shouta? The butler folded his arms. I know you must have had some questions about him. You're smarter than just trusting people blindly. Hizashi sighed. Okay, I'll admit, things are not adding up. Like? He's good at lying, Hizashi said softly. At first, I thought he was just honest, but even when he's clearly lying, his heartbeat never changes. The first time I bit him, I didn't realize he was scared because it didn't change until I was drinking his blood. A throb of shame rushed his thought. But I don't think he's a bad guy because of that. Tensei nodded in understanding, and tension eased. I don't think he's a bad guy either, but I still think you should be careful around him. Hizashi looked out the window. The rain was light now, but there was no telling whether it would remain like this. I hear you, Tensei, and I trust you. Something seemed off about the butler. There was something he wasn't telling Hizashi. Perhaps he had theories about Shouta, but if he wasn't discussing them, then he had no proof worthy enough of Yamada. Even if he couldn't trust Shouta, Hizashi trusted Tensei with his life, and so he didn't push him for more information. Does this mean Kan will have to accompany us for cello lessons? Tensei looked thoughtful. He doesn't have to be in the same room, but he should be nearby, at least until we know we can fully trust our guests. Very well, Hizashi sighed and turned his attention back to his paperwork. Go let him know. Oh, and thank you for the fruit. He quickly popped a grate into his mouth and smiled. You're a great friend, Tensei. The butler returned and smiled with his own. As you are. With that said, he turned his chair around and wheeled out of the room, leaving Hizashi alone with his paperwork in the gentle rain. Only then did he realize he had forgotten to mention Shota's fixation on Overhaul, upcoming's event, but Hizashi quickly blushed away the thought. He could always tell Tensei about it later. Alright, we have some notes. So, first of all, Shouta being all tense because someone's watching him in his room, and then hearing Hisashi's voice and immediately untensifying and calming down. Yeah, so his unconscious is already trusting Hizashi. It's already trusting Hizashi. Maybe not completely, but, to some degree, is trusting of Hizashi. But, Shota's consciousness isn't. Shota's conscious is like, nope, we're not trusting. And Shota's unconsciousness is like, yep, trust, we trust. Sometimes that happens. Your unconscious and your conscious don't really line up together. So, absolutely love how Shota's just like, yeah, that's handsome. He's handsome. For a vampire, he's handsome. Kind of handsome. Also, what the hell? He just wasn't wearing anything. I don't know why I remembered it as he was, like, you know, sleeping in his undergarments. Like, not even just your undergarments, my dude, just full out naked. Like, not even boxers? Nothing. Just naked. No underwear? No, not just naked? Okay. Okay. Okay there, buddy. Alright. We won't talk about that. Very interesting that they're both, you know, talking with each other in the rain and stuff like that, drinking hot chocolate that is clearly very bitter. And the fact that Hisashi's opening up about the fact on why he can't, you know, he doesn't handle the rain well. They both admit that to each other, and Hisashi's like, the reason why I don't like the rain is obviously, you know, the shooting. That he got shot by his dad when he was 10, and it was raining. Which, whoa. And then, obviously, Shouta reveals to Hisashi just a little bit about what happened, right? But he reveals to us the full extent. His family was killed by a rogue vampire, right? So that explains maybe why he hates vampires so much. I mean, like, I know the whole story. So, I know everything. I remember when I first read it, and I'm like, oh my god, I know everything now. This is all his backstory I need to know. Oh my god. No, I was wrong. Don't let that fool you, my dudes. There's way more to uncover. Do not let this fool you. We also get revealed that Hisashi got saved by a vampire slayer. And he also doesn't answer when, you know, Aizawa answers like, so do you like vampire slayers? Are you afraid of vampire slayers? Hisashi just ignores the answer, or ignores the question and moves on, which, very interesting. Shouta reveals something about his mother. He said, like, you know, Hisashi's like, oh yeah, like, maybe you'll learn not to hate vampires, like, hate us, right? And Shouta immediately gets enraged, but then calms down a little at the thought of a woman with black hair, and then says, my mother was, and it cuts off, because he cuts himself off. That moment, I want to talk about it. That was a moment where he almost fully opened up. I'm going to be honest with you. That was a moment where he almost fully opened up and fully talked about his whole thing and everything. But he didn't. He didn't open up. He ended up cutting himself off and like, no, I'm not going to open up. That's where his walls crumbled. Or there was a moment of his walls coming up, crumbling, and coming up again. Which walls do that. Just because they crumble down doesn't mean they're not going to build up again. That's what happens with, you know, building trust in that. Sometimes it's 3 steps forward, sometimes it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back, you know? So, yeah, that's something I wanted to talk about. Also, we learn how, you know, Shouta has trauma with rain. I forgot to mention that. I think I forgot to mention that. And my last note I want to talk about is fanfic writers with motherfucking paperwork. Okay, at first I thought this phenomenon in the My Hero Academia was because, you know, paperwork, hero paperwork, makes sense. You know, in the actual My Hero Academia main, they don't talk about paperwork like that. But then fanfiction, every fanfic writer has an obsession with paperwork, right? Sitting there and having to do the paperwork of, you know, what's it called? Of, you know, being a hero and stuff like that makes sense. I've always loved that aspect. But I was talking to another fanfic enjoyer, right? And this person isn't necessarily in the My Hero Academia fandom. They're in other fandoms and breed for other fandoms. And they say, hey, so by the way, does the My Hero Academia fandom have the paperwork syndrome? I'm like, paperwork syndrome? What? And they were just like, yeah, so fanfic writers tend to write paperwork in their books. Sometimes it doesn't even make sense that there should be paperwork. Sometimes we don't know what the paperwork is about, but they add paperwork as a show of the characters actually doing their jobs, their stuff, and stuff like that. And I'm like, oh my god, wait, hold up. This one does it. What freaking paperwork is Hisashi doing? What is he doing? Paperwork for what? It just mentions paperwork. And every character is always like, I hate paperwork. I don't want to be doing paperwork, but I have to be doing paperwork. Paperwork, paperwork, paperwork. It's not necessarily a bad thing. I find it endearing. I love it so much because it adds a little bit of character to the character. It gives them a little bit of dimension, and also it gives the world a little bit of dimension. It makes it a little more realistic. I know some fan fiction do it, others don't. Main media doesn't tend to do this. They don't tend to do this, and sometimes they do. I will say there is some that do, but most of the time they don't. And it's a very interesting phenomenon that happens that I'm realizing happens a lot in the My Hero Academia main. And the reason I guess that I just didn't notice it was because it makes sense why heroes would need to do so much paperwork. They're doing hero work and they need to write down everything that happens. I mean, police do paperwork, right? Every time they arrest someone, they have to do a bunch of paperwork for it. So it makes sense why heroes would do the same, you know? After every case, they have to do paperwork to document everything, and it makes sense. I love that, and I love that little aspect. So, paperwork syndrome in the My Hero Academia fandom isn't as like, why is there doing paperwork? That makes no sense. In this sense, it does kind of not make sense. I don't know why he's doing paperwork. Do I still love that it's an added, feature and stuff like that? Yes, I still do. I love it. I think that's one of those aspects where it's like, I don't care if it doesn't motherfucking make sense. I want to see them doing freaking paperwork. Or just mention, I have to do paperwork. Ugh. I don't know. It doesn't necessarily need to make sense, I think it's one of those little quirky little things that fanfictions can have and stuff like that. But yeah. As always, my raindrops, make sure to eat, sleep, drink water, take your meds. Have a wonderful day or night. Link to our Discord server and my socials are down in the description. Subscribe to see more of my content, and thank you so much for watching.